From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you updated on the news that made headlines this last week around our region. Today, our panel includes Logan Ramsey, reporter at eastidahonews.com, Emma Epperly with Idaho Education News, and Sarah Cutler, reporter with the Idaho Statesman. And today, we are going to spend this first segment talking with Logan, and here is why. We are beginning with the tragic incident in Pocatello that has gained national attention, and it's also raising serious questions about how law enforcement responds to individuals with disabilities. This after 17-year-old Victor Perez, who had autism and cerebral palsy and was nonverbal, was fatally shot by police officers after officers responded to a report of a man with a knife. And Logan and all of the staff at eastidahonews.com have been following this story since it happened. So Logan, I want to begin at the beginning. When dispatch received a 911 call from a person who was witnessing the incident happening in Perez's backyard. Now, this happened on April 5th. Can you describe for us what the caller described to dispatch when they made that call?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a quote that probably helps to encompass a lot of what the caller was saying at the beginning was when he said, one guy's got a knife and looks like he's under the influence and they're out in the backyard chasing each other around. He gave them information about how it looked like that Victor to him, it looked like he was intoxicated and trying to stab some of the family members. But as he went on in the call, he also told them more information about how he keeps falling over, and he mentions that it looks like Victor had accidentally stabbed himself. At one point, he told them that they weren't speaking English in their interactions as they were trying to remove this knife from Victor's hand. And he also mentioned the possibility, another person on the call also mentioned the possibility that Victor was having a seizure, and that they later told the dispatcher that nobody looked like they were too hurt besides the guy with the knife. That's a lot of what they were told on the what dispatcher was told on the call.
And I have watched a video from eastidahonews.com that your organization has posted, where it did show some security footage of exactly what you described. And I have to say, Logan, you can understand why the person who made that call said, "Oh, it does look like maybe he's under the influence. Oh, he's stumbling, this and that." And with that information that the caller did give dispatch, they did have police show up. They were dispatched to the scene. So Logan, had officers at this point, when they were dispatched to the scene, were they given any information about Victor's disabilities?
They weren't given any information specifically about Victor's disabilities. I think that now's probably a good time for me to mention that the 911 caller, Bridger Andrus, who has been identified since making this call, has and his father Brad Andrus have expressed a feeling that the buck is getting passed to them in a way, essentially, of like what they informed them on the call. And I think it would be good to mention that they have talked about how they feel that it was the police's responsibility to recognize what was going on in this situation. And they spoke about that at a community meeting that I'll probably end up referencing later, held by the law firm that is representing the Perez family. But I can get a little bit more into that meeting later, I think.
Oh, okay. And I was going to say, Logan, I think that's a really good point that you just made, because we've all been told if you see something, say something, right? And that's exactly what this son and father did when they called dispatch. And I think that when you watch the video, you can understand why they made the call and said what they said. So that's unfortunate, and we will get into more of what they said at this community meeting. But before we get there, let's go back to April 5th. So after this phone call is made, dispatch says, has police go to the scene. These police officers arrive on the scene. As we said, no knowledge of Victor's disabilities. Walk us through what happens next.
So, yeah, the officers, they were moving quickly. They very quickly exited their vehicles. At least some of them were immediately drawing their guns as they exited the vehicles. It's not clear on the body cam footage, but on the cell phone footage that was taken, you can see at least one officer draw his pistol as he's exiting the vehicle. Um, when they arrived at the fence line, they went up to that fence line. They with their guns drawn and began to shout at Victor to drop the knife. And Victor struggles to stand up. And when he moved forward to the officers, they fired their weapons, and he fell back on the ground. And from the time that the officers exited their vehicles to when they fired their shots, it depends on who you're counting, which officer you're looking
Mm-hmm.
at when you start counting. But around 15 to 20 seconds is around how long the entire interaction lasted.
Right. And I think it's really important to note, Logan, you mentioned a fence, is that there was a chain link fence. And Victor was on one side of that in his backyard. Police were on the other side of that. And from what I viewed on that video, Victor wasn't even up against that chain link fence. Is that correct? I mean, he was in the yard, but he was not like up against that fence at all.
That's correct. And his two of his family members were standing about a few feet away from him.
So, Logan, yesterday the city of Pocatello released additional footage from this shooting. Can you tell us what new video was actually released?
So as for video, they released what you mentioned earlier, the security footage showing the around 15-minute interaction that Victor Perez's family was having, and they released body cam footage of two officers. They also released they've played this before, but they again released the audio of the 911 call, and
Mm-hmm.
the audio of the dispatch, the dispatch conversation between the officers and the dispatcher.
So there was a news conference yesterday, correct? That was held by the mayor of Pocatello and the police chief. Well, did they
Yeah.
give any reasoning for releasing more video footage?
Yeah, and so like what I can say is like what Mayor Brian Blatt told us is that
Uh-huh.
like everywhere he's going, he's being asked questions that he can't answer because of the investigation that's being conducted by the Eastern Idaho Critical Incident Task Force, as well as the pending litigation that we've talked a little bit about. But that he said that he believed that this additional footage and audio that they released would answer some of these questions that have been, circling around the community.
Mhm. Well, since the shooting of Victor Perez, I mean, this story has not only gained immense national attention, as you know, Logan, it's also garnered criticism of police, in particular the Pocatello Police Department, with critics questioning the lack of de escalation efforts and the use of lethal force instead of non lethal options. I am curious about what the city and/or police are saying about this criticism because, as you mentioned, when you look at that video and how you view it, somewhere between 15 to 20 seconds from when police left their vehicles is when they shot Victor Perez. I don't know if anything can be de escalated in 15 to 20 seconds when in a situation like we saw in that video.
I think that anything that I could say to them specifically responding to the use of force would kind of be
Mm-hmm.
me adding conjecture because they
Okay.
they they haven't said anything specifically about
And that's
that.
fair enough. And that's what I wanted to know if they had said anything specific about that. So The other thing I want to ask, though, Logan, is that one officer did actually shoot a bean bag round. For folks who aren't familiar, tell us what that is.
Yeah, well, and I'm certainly not a firearms expert. I learned this just a little bit ago, actually, but they're not a rubber bullet. What essentially they are is that they're a round that is encased in a bag where the metal pellets are in this bag, and rather than spread out as they're fired, the bag stays intact and impacts the person who's being shot. Um, yeah, and they are sometimes called non-lethal rounds, but it's
Hmm.
more accurate to say that they're less lethal rounds because, you can still easily be killed by one of these if you get hit somewhere where you're vulnerable, like the head or the neck. Um, yeah.
And we do know that I said there were three officers involved in this. As we mentioned, one officer did the beanbag round, the other two officers did not. How many times was Victor Perez shot?
So nine times. He was shot. The family told me that the doctors removed nine bullets from his
Mm.
body.
So, Logan, what has been the reaction in Pocatello since this incident? You mentioned at the top of our conversation that there have been some community events.
Yeah, yeah, and like the thing that like I don't want to put my own spin on this, but
Hmm.
like the thing that I'll say is that I've never seen so many people in this community that I've grown up in all my life care so deeply about the same thing.
Mm.
A lot of people have expressed their grief and how much they're grieving at. There's been that community meeting that I referenced with the law
Hmm.
firm around. I think it was around like 20 people or so who were there. It was like a much smaller, more intimate sort of thing. It went on for around an hour and a half. Um, there was a protest that happened the day that not immediately, but the day that the footage of the video started getting shared widely. And last night there was a city council meeting where I think it was around 11 or so people who spoke and addressed the council directly, but the whole room was packed with people holding
Hmm.
different like protest signs, and people told the council and expressed their grief and the way that this incident has affected them.
Hmm. And you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, Logan, the father and son who did call 911. They were at this community meeting. Can you talk a little bit more about what they said? Because as you mentioned, they're kind of feeling like they're being blamed for this incident happening.
Yeah, yeah, that they've expressed that uh, they expressed that in the community meeting. I think like a good encompassing quote would be what I put in my story from what Bridger was saying in the meeting, where he said that I made that phone call to make sure that everybody was going to be safe. I made that phone call because what I saw was a man with a knife possibly attacking somebody. However, the police interpret that. That's what their training needs to cover. Um, that's the major sentiment that I
Hmm.
think that they have expressed.
So I want to go back to Victor because tragically he died on April 12th. You've had a chance to talk with his family. What did his family tell you?
Yeah, and we talked about a lot of stuff, but they gave me a little bit of insight, like what their side of the story was on what was
Hmm.
taking place in the backyard before the police officers arrived, and they told me that that things like this had happened before, but it was situations where Victor like had a big spoon, that you would cook with. They were being
Hmm.
so careful because he had gotten his hands on a knife, where they weren't sure how he found it, but yeah, they said that they were being a lot more careful and that he wasn't trying to stab them, rather that he was waving the knife and
Hmm.
doing what he had done previously.
And Logan, what did the family say anything to you about what was happening on that day before police arrived?
We talked about it. We talked about that a little bit. And if I'm remembering from our conversation, right, I didn't look at this specifically before this specific part before we talked, but I believe that they told
Hmm.
me that they were getting ready for a barbecue. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm quite positive that that's what they were told me.
So, just one day before this new video was released, it was released yesterday. As you mentioned, a law firm, it's a high profile law firm, filed a claim of wrongful death and civil rights violations against the city. Can you tell us about this law firm that is now representing Victor's family?
Yeah, this is absolutely a high profile law firm. They've represented Rodney King. They represented Tupac Shakur. They also represented the family of Oscar Grant. So they have a lot of experience with this. And at the community meeting, they talked about how, they represent clients that you never hear about. Also, like
Mm,
tons of clients a year, all
hmm.
on issues of like civil rights.
So my understanding is that the firm released a statement when they filed this claim on Wednesday, and I also believe one of the lawyers on the case spoke with the Associated Press as well. Do you have any bit of information about what they said in that statement?
I don't. I'm not familiar with that. I haven't seen their statement to
Okay.
the AP.
So Logan, what does the law firm plan to do next since they've filed this claim? Because there's not an actual lawsuit yet, correct?
Yeah. Rather than me trying to, get into all of the specific legal
Uh-huh.
steps that they're going to go through, because I'm just not the best person to talk to about that. I think that it's important for people to have a realistic idea of how long this is going to take, what the time
Yeah.
frame is going to be. And they've told me that at the community meeting, I asked them, and they said that, this is a minimum of 3 years before it even goes to
Oh,
trial. Um,
okay.
like that 3 years is the soonest that you would see it go to trial, but it could be 5 years. It could be even longer than that, and there could be further appeals afterwards.
Hmm.
So there's really no telling how long this will go on
Yeah.
for, but it will be the trial, this civil trial, which it's also important to make that distinction that this is a civil trial and it's not a criminal proceeding against the police officers from the police officers in question. It's a civil trial for Perez's
Right.
family.
Yeah, right. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. Before I let you go, Logan, what about those police officers involved in this shooting? What is happening with them right now?
And that's also something that I don't know, and I don't think any of the reporters in this area know either. I
So
like
they've not been placed
all
on
that we
leave.
know.
Like we don't know that.
Yeah. No, no, no. Also, all that is all that we know is that they were placed on administrative leave. And
Okay.
that's about it.
That is as far as we know. Well, Logan, I know there's still a lot of questions around this. I appreciate all of the reporting that you and EastIdahoNews.com have done on this, and appreciate you answering all of our questions. So, Sarah, let's begin with what happened on Monday in Nampa when Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez held a rally in Nampa, and thousands of people showed up. What did some of them have to say about why they were attending?
Thank you for having me. And yeah, as you say, it was a large event. I think the center where it was held was maxed out pretty much at about 12,500 people. And we heard a lot of people saying that, they weren't necessarily attending along party lines, but rather were there to protest over what they were seeing as what they were calling a growing oligarchy in the US. There was a lot of anger at billionaire Elon Musk, who has been slashing government jobs. There was anger at the Trump administration seeming disregard for due process in some cases or democratic norms. And a lot of these, concerns we heard from people are national, but it was also striking to see some of the local issues filtering in. We saw, I would say, hundreds of people wearing t-shirts that said, "Everyone is welcome here," which was sort of a
Mm,
shout out to a recent episode where a West Ada teacher was told to take down a sign in her classroom that had those words. And it seems like they've become kind of a rallying cry for the left. But I would say overall the biggest takeaway from both the speakers, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and from the people attending is that they weren't necessarily gunning for a Democrat to take office, but rather were concerned about the state of our democracy and our country.
mhm,
There was a sense that the country isn't working for many Americans and that we've got a few people at the top worth billions of dollars, and then the vast majority of Americans are struggling to make ends meet.
mhm. Well, and Sarah, one of the things that I found interesting from your article that you wrote about this too, and I believe one of the attendees said, there's this misperception that there aren't any real Democrats that live in Idaho, right? Or they're transplants. And a lot of them said, no, that's not true. Born and raised in Idaho. But also, as you mentioned, that a lot of this wasn't along party lines, correct?
Right, exactly. I think, we definitely did talk to people who identified as Democrats and who wanted to give
Hmm.
visibility to Democrats in the state. But yeah, we definitely were hearing from people who, uh, you know, their concerns were almost, I would say, bigger picture about the state of our country rather than which particular party is in power.
Hmm. And Sarah, I think many people were surprised actually that this tour actually decided to make a stop in Idaho and that the Fort Idaho Center was filled to capacity. You spoke with Jacqueline Cutler. She's a political science professor at Boise State. Tell us what she said about why the decision to hold an event in Idaho worked to the degree that it did.
I thought her take on this was so interesting. Her perspective was that Bernie Sanders may resonate with people here and certainly did in the past in 2016 when he did very well in the Democratic caucus here. But her perspective was basically that, he is very anti-establishment, anti-elite, anti kind of political insiders. And she was saying that that is a sentiment that really resonates with people in Idaho on both the right and the left. From her perspective, a lot of Idahoans' support for Donald Trump could potentially be chalked up to some of those same inclinations,
Hmm.
I guess. And as I mentioned, I should, double tap the fact that Sanders, I think, explicitly did say at the rally that he and Ocasio-Cortez are deliberately visiting parts of the country that Democrats may have long overlooked or have written off as impossible to win. But I think these are places where they're wondering whether there may be an appetite for a different kind of leadership.
Hmm. Appreciate that insight. Emma, the Idaho Commission for Libraries is preparing for the possible loss of federal funding. Before we get into all of that, tell us what the Idaho Commission for Libraries is and what they do.
So the Idaho Commission for Libraries assists a variety of libraries statewide. They're home to the state librarian, and they're overseen by the Board of Library Commissioners, who are appointed by the governor. They get both federal and state funds, which typically pass through to individual libraries for specific programs.
So tell us what happened last week and why the commission approved the use of alternative funds to pay staff.
Yeah, so last week, the commission held a special meeting to potentially use $300,000 of state library services improvement funds to pay staff if they lose some of their federal funding. The commission gets about 26% of its funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services at the federal level. And I should just say, Mia Maldonado at the Idaho Capitol Sun also did a really great story on this on Wednesday. So I kind of used some of her reporting as well.
Well, I appreciate you pointing that out. So,
Yeah.
Emma, you mentioned it's always good to give credit. So, Emma, you mentioned you mentioned the Institute for Museum and Library Services. Who are they?
Mhm. Yeah, so the Institute was created in 1996, and it provides funding to libraries, museums, and archives in all 50 states.
Okay, so why did they end these grants mid-year?
So, President Donald Trump targeted the Institute and 7 other smaller federal agencies in an executive order on March 14th titled Continuing the Reduction of Federal Bureaucracies. And the order reduces elements of the federal bureaucracy that Trump has determined are unnecessary.
And so they then were basically hands tied and had to end the grants, I'm assuming?
Yeah. So under that executive order, the Institute's board was dismissed and 70 employees were fired. And so that led to the American Library Association, which is a national union, filing a lawsuit pushing back on those terminations. And so the ALA is arguing that the move's illegal because without congressional oversight, they say the Institute cannot be eliminated. A quote from the lawsuit, which is reported by the New York Times, says Congress is the only entity that may lawfully dismantle the agency, not the president, and certainly not Doge.
So what happens next then? This lawsuit has been filed, as you said, by the American Library Association, but what happens for the Idaho Commissions for Libraries? I mean, do they know for sure if they will lose federal funding?
So they don't know for sure. They were being proactive by holding this meeting last week and ensuring that they could spend these funds. Idaho's really in limbo. Several states have lost their funding, including California and Washington. And it's unclear if that's politically motivated or if those are just the first states in a slow rollout of grant cuts. Like I said, most of the people who worked at the Institute don't work there anymore. And that's tied up in litigation. So it's unclear if, even if those grants continue, if the money will be able to be given to Idaho, because it's unclear who really works there right now. So the transfer of funds last week was just to make sure that if Idaho does lose that funding, the commission could pay out employees' vacation time and give them the legally required 15-day notice ahead of layoffs. If Idaho does lose funding, programs like the Idaho Talking Book Service, which provides free audiobook services for disabled Idahoans, would be terminated.
Oh, so that's important for people to know because that's a very needed service for Idahoans.
Yes, and so it's unclear exactly like the totality of the programs that would be eliminated, but I thought that was a good example of one that many disabled Idahoans use.
So at this point, just so I'm clear, Emma, basically everything's in limbo. So again, the Idaho Commission for Libraries is trying to be proactive, but at the same time, not knowing what could happen tomorrow.
Right. They don't know if they're going to lose their federal funding, lose that grant. They don't know if they're going to continue to get the grant, but those funds might be delayed disbursement. So it's just really in limbo right now, but they're trying their best to be prepared.
Sarah, can you tell us about the bill that Governor Little signed into law on April 3rd, banning what they call non-official flags from flying on government properties?
Sure. So this was House Bill 96, and it basically said that government entities, including cities, can fly only official flags on their property. And that would include things like the US flag, the state flag, city flags, and it had a couple of additional, I guess you could say, exceptions for things like local university flags or the prisoner of war flag, that kind of thing.
So, Sarah, when the bill was being debated in the State House, my understanding is that the pride flag that hangs at Boise City Hall was actually used as an example for flags that they don't want flying on government property. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So yeah, when the bill was first being promoted and debated on the House and Senate floors, the sponsor, Representative Heather Scott, did distribute photos of a pride flag that had been hanging, or that continues to hang, actually outside of Boise City Hall for quite a long time, as well as pride flags along Harrison Boulevard in the North End. And yeah, these were used as, kind of examples of the flags that they were hoping might come down. Others have mentioned flags like, Blue Lives Matter or Don't Tread on Me, those types of flags.
So, as you mentioned, the flag that the pride flag at Boise City Hall, even though we're past April 3rd and the law went into effect, that flag is still flying at City Hall.
Yes, exactly. So the flag remains up, and actually, as of Friday, the city even added a second flag in honor of Organ Donation Month. And technically, that would also be considered illegal under the law, which took immediate effect. And I should say that, from my perspective, the flag raising on Friday seemed like the city kind of trying to make an additional statement. It posted a picture on its social media of the new flag along with the existing pride flag. And it also, I believe, live streamed that flag raising ceremony. So it seemed like the city was potentially trying to make a statement with this.
So, Sarah, you mentioned flags along Harrison Boulevard in Boise's North End, pride flags in particular. So, under this new law, would those flags also not be allowed to fly because Harrison Boulevard is it's not private property; it's owned by the city of Boise?
Right, that was something we looked into when the bill was still under consideration, and at least at that time, our understanding was that ACHD, the Ada County Highway District, a government entity, has control over that median where the flags are hanging. So yeah, the understanding from ACHD at that point was that those flags would not be allowed either.
So, Sarah, since the pride flag is still flying at Boise City Hall, has the city said anything about why they've decided to keep the flag up?
Fortunately, I was able to sit down yesterday with the mayor, Lauren McLean, who told us that, the city basically doesn't believe that it is a crime to fly this flag because the new law does not have any provision for enforcement or a penalty associated with it. So McLean did tell me that the city is taking into consideration a recent letter it received from the state's attorney general, who was urging her to take down the flag, telling her that, she shouldn't allow her personal beliefs or politics to override a state law. He said that the law kind of relied on the goodwill of local leaders to enforce. But fundamentally, McLean said, his letter acknowledges that there's no enforcement provision here. And she also emphasized that the flag has been up outside City Hall for a very long time and has never been a problem. And that from her perspective, it's a very important symbol of the city's inclusivity. So the city wants to keep it flying.
Yeah, I mean that flag. I mean it's been up there for years. So I want to go back to this part about the enforcement or lack thereof of this new law. So what you're saying is that the legislature put this bill in place, goes in front of the governor signs it into law. So now we have a law on the books that says you can't fly these non-official flags on government property. Yet we didn't put anything in there on how to enforce this. There's no penalties. There's no fines. So I guess that means the city can violate it because there's no repercussion. Am I reading that properly?
You are reading that properly. McLean is right. The bill has no provision for enforcement. It doesn't really have an or else if you keep flying a flag. That said, Attorney General Labrador did tell McLean in that letter I mentioned that lawmakers were already discussing next year in the next legislative session, potentially adding an enforcement provision. So this may not be, the end of the story. I think we may hear more about this. I should note too that there was a separate letter that the city received from Ada County Sheriff Matt Clifford, who told the city, and I think he issued a public statement to this effect as well, but he said that his staff were being inundated with complaints about this flag, demanding that he do something. But in his letter, he was actually sort of critical of the lawmakers who passed this bill, saying that they had passed a bill without clear direction and urging them in the future to, work with subject matter experts to make sure that the laws have teeth if they want to pass them.
Yeah, might be helpful. Appreciate that update, Sarah. Emma, talk to us about a new pilot program that Superintendent of Public Instruction, Debbie Critchfield, launched earlier this week.
Yeah, so on Wednesday, Critchfield headed up to Sandpoint for an event to launch this parent partner program. So the program is for families with children who get special education services. And so that process can be really confusing for parents. Once their child gets diagnosed with a disability that would require them to get special education services, there's this very lengthy process, which was kind of presented and gone through on Wednesday. There was a packet that had a sheet with a bunch of acronyms on it that parents would need to know as they go through this process. It had like 20 acronyms. So I think that's just a good example of how complicated this process can be, and the language surrounding the process can be really confusing for parents. They kind of talked about IEP meetings, so individual education plan meetings, where the parent will come in and there'll be an administrator, a general education teacher, a special education teacher, any supports that that child might need. So like a speech language pathologist potentially as an example. And parents can feel really overwhelmed in those meetings. They're just trying to advocate for their child, but it can be confusing. All the people in the meeting are professionals. So this program that Critchfield is launching a pilot of in the Lake Pond School District in Sandpoint would pair parents or guardians of children who already are receiving these services, who've already been through the process, with parents who are just starting out, in hopes of creating community and giving parents a chance to kind of support each other through the process organically.
And my understanding, Emma, is that this launch comes after the Idaho legislature basically rejected the majority of Critchfield's proposals to close a pretty big educational gap. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because this is what, like an $80 million gap?
Yeah, that's the right number. So there's an $80 million gap between what Idaho schools are currently spending on special education services versus what the money they get from state and federal funds. So they're spending $80 million more on these services than what they're getting from state and federal government. And schools aren't going to be getting much in the way of additional resources this year. So Critchfield wanted to, create a pilot program that is going to address issues in a way she can without additional funding. She really hopes that this program, there'll be some data that shows that this reduces friction points or unresolved cases for school districts, and then they're going to put together a document so other districts could implement a similar program after the pilot concludes.
So before we wrap up, Emma, I also want to quickly talk, and I've got about 2 minutes left with you, about 24 school districts across Idaho that are going to be asking voters for a combined total of more than $220 million on the May ballot. Can you tell us about a few of these critical asks? And let's talk about North Idaho in particular, because administrators there say without this money, it's going to be layoffs and programs being eliminated?
Yeah. So avid listeners will remember we talked about this a couple weeks ago, right after the ballot deadline. And since then, we've gone back through all of the county clerks and gathered more of these asks than what I talked about last time. So you're right, $220 million on the May ballot. North Idaho has some really asks that will have big impacts on the school districts if they don't pass. So in Lakeland, trustees have reduced their levy ask by $2 million from a failed levy in November. And if the levy doesn't pass, the district will lose 25 teachers. But even if the levy does pass, they're already going to lose 25 staff members due to that $2 million in cuts. And then in West Bonner, if the levy fails, the district will likely close 2 schools, leaving just 1 elementary and the junior senior high school open. Another ballot measure that we could highlight is the Shelley Joint School District is asking for a $78 million bond. So just a reminder for listeners, bonds are to build things, and supplemental levies are for like operation costs. So think like athletic programs, those types of things. But bonds are for buildings. So in Shelley, they serve about 2,500 students this year, and they had a failed bond measure in November of 2023. They're coming back for another chance to pass that. And their current high school is over capacity. It's the most over capacity of their schools. It already has 3 modular buildings that they're using to alleviate that overcrowding. And then they have 3 other schools that are at full capacity. So this $78 million would really be a total facilities revamp for the district. And another reminder, bonds need a supermajority or 66.7% of the vote to pass, unlike supplemental levies, which just need a majority.
All right. Well, I appreciate that update, Emma. I want to thank both of you so much for joining us today. We've been speaking with Logan Ramsey, reporter at EastIdahoNews.com, Emma Epperly with Idaho Education News, and Sarah Cutler, reporter with the Idaho Statesman. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudet.